Welcome, dear learners. The topic of today's talk is Content and Language Integrated Learning Methodology, or Clil methodology. Nowadays, we hear a lot of discussions related to integrating content and language in classrooms. And what is Content Integrated Language Learning, or Clil? It is a learner-centered approach, and the second thing is that content learning and language acquisition are integrated in a single classroom. It can be a subject classroom like a classroom for teaching chemistry or physics, and again it can be partially supported in a language classroom. So, naturally there should be a collaboration of language teachers and subject teachers, as we find that all the language elements cannot be handled by the subject teachers. So, the language teachers can support the language that is needed for successful subject learning. We find that the basics of Clil are given in the 4 C's framework proposed by Coyle. There we have 4 C's like content, communication, cognition and culture. Content refers to the subject that is taught in the classroom. Communication refers to the second language through which subject is taught. Cognition refers to the thinking process related to subject learning. And finally, we have the culture related to interpersonal relation or knowing the other person. And these 4 C's integrate in local contexts. For example, a classroom in a particular region. And in this talk, I would like to share some views related to how Clil can be practiced in classrooms. It is based on 3 main phases like preparation, then the activity phase, and finally the review phase, known as the PAR phases. And coming to the first phase, that is preparation, we find that actually Clil deals with a withdrawal of teacher from the real active lecturing, and instead of that there is a kind of learning having active role of the learners. And so a very good preparation has to be made in advance, so that the learners are involved in the process of learning. The first thing that should be done in advance before going to the preparation of materials needed for learning is that the teachers should have an evaluation of the learners, and they should also know what's going to be transacted. There are 4 aspects related to that. The first 2 related to the learners. The teachers should identify the prior subject knowledge and the language the students possess. And the second thing is that the teachers should have an idea about what all requirements are needed for learning that particular context, that content, and what all language is required for learning that subject in an effective manner. and for that we can have the some kind of online tests or an achievement test by which we get the actual level of the learners in relation to subject and in relation to the language. And while preparing the materials for transaction, these 4 things have to be kept in mind. And coming to the next part, that is for the preparation of materials, the first thing that should be kept in mind is that the learners will have a kind of active learning in the classrooms, and the second thing is that there will be construction of knowledge, and the preparation of materials should be in such a manner that it will facilitate a kind of active learning in the classrooms. And there are 4 things that should be kept in mind. The first one is that identification of suitable and viable communicative language teaching techniques that can be used in the classrooms. It can be multisensory and it can be multimodal, and the teachers should consider aspects like the higher order thinking skills, like dealing with evaluation and construction. And again, the teachers should have an idea about the basic interpersonal communication skills or the basic communication skills, and the academic language or cognitive academic language proficiency that should be developed in a content classroom. And the second thing that is related to the preparation of materials is that there should be a kind of adaptation of the materials provided or the subject. The second thing is that there should be kind of adaptation of the text in 2 ways. One is to reduce the difficulty level of the text, the materials that is provided, and the second thing is to make it interactive. Actually, most of the students may not be able to follow the syllabus, the materials given for learning, so that a kind of adaptation, reducing the difficulty level and making it more interactive, including a lot of activities and providing a scope for development of their understanding using different sensory perceptions. And pictures can be provided, graphical organizers can be provided, and they can also be supported by additional digital resources. And the next thing related to the preparation is that even though this cannot be a very rigid format in which it should be followed in Clil, but these phases can provide a general framework under which we can frame the materials and the phases in Clil classrooms. This is from the book Clil Activities by Liz Dale and Rosie Tanner. And the phases include activating, guiding understanding, focus on language, focus on speaking, focus on writing, assessment, review and feedback. And coming to the 4th one, that is related to scaffolding, that actually comes from the part of the teachers. And when the materials are prepared, the teachers should have an idea about the difficult areas that have to be supported, and that makes learning easier for the students. And the teachers should also think about the different scaffolding techniques in advance so that such a kind of support can be given in classrooms. And I think I will just give an example about all these aspects to make the idea more clear. Let us discuss about the basic aspects of mechanical engineering, and the topic is properties of metals, and the level is, it's a higher education level, and we find that coming to the first phase, that is activating, and related to how we can prepare the materials, and it can be given in the adapted materials. Some questions like, now actually coming to activating is actually activating previous understanding or previous knowledge of the learners. So such questions can be asked to the learners so that they get accustomed to the topic, and they get it's a kind of entry towards the actual content. Questions like why particular things are used to make items in and around your classroom can be asked, and so they look around and they find things like the window frame, the fan, the lighting arrangements, all these things can be, they go through all these aspects and they think about why some materials are used to for making those items. And questions like pure gold is used to make jewelry, they can answer yes or no, and iron is used to make electric wires. They will think about these questions, and they can give their opinion about why particular things are used, materials are used to prepare particular objects. And coming to the second phase, that is guiding understanding. This is the most important phase in which actual learning takes place. We find that the learners interact using the materials provided to them, and we find that relating that to the example that we have just mentioned, and there are a lot of properties related to metals like strength, then hardness, toughness, resilience, creep, and in order to support these things, we can provide a lot of pictures. Then as I already mentioned, some digital resources can be used, and all these materials should lead towards construction of ideas in the classroom, and it is developed using some kind of dialogic learning, and learners are also given scope for writing down what they have understood using their own language, and learners can also write down what they have understood in their own language. And coming to the next phase, that is focus on language, and it is to introduce the language that is necessary for learning the content, and again it's can be used for reinforcing the language elements that should be learned in the classroom. Actually, they have used all those language elements in the second phase of guiding understanding. Now, this is a kind of reinforcing those elements, language elements, like it's a reinforcement of vocabulary that can be done. And again, there can be some subject specific language, like the words like resist instead of object, and the word like absorb instead of take, like absorbing energy instead of taking energy, and words like indicated instead of shown, and words like deform instead of change. And again, as I have already mentioned about reinforcing vocabulary, like related to such a kind of topic like ceramics, polymers, tensile test, plasticity, then brittleness, then tenacity. For this purpose, things like bingo card that's shown on the screen that can be used. Then bingo cards are it's a kind of a card in which the specific terms are given in boxes, and the teacher will read the definition, and immediately the students can locate the term related to that definition, and that's kind of bingo card. And then the crossword puzzles, then the use of Wordle. Wordle is or a word cloud that's again over and again jumbles words in the jumbled order. That also can be used for reinforcing vocabulary. And again, actually what we find among learners is that they make a lot of spelling errors, and in order to identify that, in order to correct them, specific activities related to spelling can be given, like breakpad. Often they use the word spelling BREAK. Then crystalline, words like ferrous, availability, amorphous, and such a kind of such activities can be given in the classrooms. And then related to articles and prepositions, like resistance to instead of resistance for something. Then language structures like compare and contrast, using but on the other hand, then either or, and then passive voice constructions related to this topic, like then force is applied using the passive voice construction, and using definitions. Definitely we need a lot of definitions. For that, it is, this method is termed as, such constructions of phrases can be used. And in order to prepare a list, like it include the following are, etc., can be used. And again, for giving some reasons related to this topic, like because, so, as, it is. Then using sentence connectors like then, after that, next. And another aspect is such things can be used can be given to the learners using some kind of activities. And again, punctuation and use of capital letters can also be emphasized. And next is the use of speaking, that is the phase, that the fourth phase is the focus on speaking, where the primary idea is that students should think about fluency rather than accuracy. Actually, our learners usually have this problem of speaking, and the pronunciation aspects can be used in this phase. It can be actually from the beginning till the end, the students get a lot of opportunities for developing their speaking skills. Actually, they are interacting in the classrooms. So, in addition to that, such a kind of formal speaking activities like a kind of team teaching to the entire class by some 3 or 4 students. There can be some kind of debates, then kind of balloon debates, hot seat activities, and another thing which is very important, very useful, is related to information gap activities, where we find some information is missing given to, related to an activity given to the first student, and he can access that from the second student, so that there is a kind of interaction which actually improves speaking skills. And again, coming to the next one, the next phase is coming to, that's focus on writing, and they write down what they have understood in their own language. They can make use of graphic organizers, they can prepare some charts. It's a kind of personalized learning. And for example, in relation to this topic, they can give definitions, they can give their own definitions related to the properties of metals, and they can make use of some kind of tree diagrams to chart all those properties. And coming to the next phase, that is the final phase in that is the assessment, review and feedback. And in preparing these aspects, the teachers can prepare some kind of rubrics which help them, the learners themselves assess them. So, self-evaluative rubrics can be prepared, and then there can be peer evaluation, and finally coming to teacher evaluation, which can be done using the rubrics prepared in advance. And coming to the second phase of activity, that is the actual classroom learning process, and we find that two things happen during the classroom activity phase. One is, the first one is the learner activity that we find happening in the classrooms using the materials prepared in advance. And the second thing is the teacher support given to the learners in the process of learning. And we find that for learning activities, we find that it happens in three phases. The first one is the individual phase, the individual level of learning, then pair work, and finally coming to group work. And all these levels of learning actually promote effective talk inside the classrooms. And we find that coming to the activities, a lot of realia can be brought to the classrooms. For example, we can bring such a kind of, to show resilience using a spring, or we can bring a sheet, something like that, a flattened metal showing the malleability, or we can bring a thin wire to the classroom for demonstration that can be given to the learners themselves, so they get a first hand idea about what they are actually learning, and it shows the ductility. And some foldable boards can be given to the learners so that they can prepare some diagrams according to what they have actually learned from discussions and interactions. And we find that jigsaw reading is one of the useful activities that can be used in our classrooms, especially classrooms having a number of students. And I think I will just again mention about the example given earlier related to properties of metals, and jigsaw reading can be effectively used in transacting the idea. The materials, the properties of materials like strength, hardness, toughness, resilience, brittleness, creep, fatigue, stiffness, all these topics can be given to students sitting in different benches. The first benches can be given, for example, strength. The second benches can be given the topic hardness. And what happens is that the first phase is it's kind of individual learning, and each student reads the main text, the core text, and the supportive adapted text, and he gets some idea related to the topic like strength. And in the second phase of pair work, he shares what all things that he has understood about strength to the second person, and the second person also conveys the ideas that he has understood related to strength. And after the second phase, there is a group work in the first bench, so that we find the four learners sitting on the first bench, they will have kind of interaction, so that they will discuss related to have a discussion related to the topic strength. Then the first benchers can sit backwards so that they can share their ideas about related to strength to the second benchers, and in turn we find that the second benchers will share their ideas related to hardness. And actually the first two benchers will have a good idea about these two topics, and then we have altogether 8 students sitting in both benches, and 6 of them will go to the next 6 groups. So that such a kind of reshuffling happens in the entire class, and so the final grouping will have each learner having a good idea about all the topics, and such a kind of activity goes throughout the class. And coming to the second phase of teacher support, it actually happens in the form of scaffolding, and scaffolding is a kind of temporary support given to learners in the form of pictures, in the form of presenting vocabulary in context, and relating some new ideas to their previous knowledge, and again asking questions so that it makes the students think about certain things, and again breaking up of complex ideas into tiny bits. All these things can be used in the classrooms by the teachers, and lecturing shouldn't be kept away from the classrooms. It has its own role, especially in the final phase of the class. A 5 minutes or 10 minutes lecturing can be done, which can actually support the knowledge that is actually acquired by the learners throughout using the interaction. And some more things have to be kept in mind when dealing with the role of teachers. That is, the teachers should make the instructions very clear. They can question check the instructions so that they can verify whether the learners have clearly understood what they are supposed to do in the classrooms. And then the teachers should also ensure that minimum time is given for teacher talk, and maximum time should be provided for student talk. And then the teachers can make corrections of errors, like using something like recasting, where the same sentences used by the learners can be repeated by the teachers in a correct manner. And drilling and reinforcing of the items learned by students can also be done in the classrooms. And coming to certain other aspects related to activities in the classrooms, the first thing is that the first language shouldn't be completely avoided in the classrooms. It can be used in the classrooms for getting more clarity about certain complex, vague concepts. It can be used in the classrooms. And the second aspect is that having a lot of interaction in the classroom and getting a lot of freedom to interact with the fellow learners will actually motivate the learners, and such a kind of motivation is seen in the classrooms, and the learners can even be used in the other phases of preparation of materials, and they can be actively included in the evaluation phase also. And the teachers also should ensure that the involvement of learners is there in all the phases in Clil. And actually we find that related to the role of language teachers and subject teachers, it can be done in different phases, like the language teachers can support the language elements needed for subject learning in the language classrooms. Again, the language teachers can actually equip the subject teachers so that learning of both subject and the language elements can be done in the subject classrooms itself. Or if we go to the other extreme, we can find that there can be kind of team teaching. If it is viable in our circumstances, that can be also used, where it can be both the content teacher and the language teacher can go to the same class, and they can deal with their respective elements. And in relation to the extent of Clil that can be used in classrooms, it can be we can use a minimum of 20% of the entire topics can be transacted using Clil techniques. Then it can come up to 50% of the entire curriculum can be transacted using Clil, and it can go much beyond that also. And coming to the third phase, and we have discussed about the two phases, that is the preparation phase, the activity phase, and coming to the last phase, that is the review phase. And review is actually having an overall understanding of what actually happened inside and outside the classrooms, from the preparation phase in the activity session and coming to the evaluation that happens at the end of the classroom. And for that, the teachers related to teaching can get support from other fellow teachers, and the learners can also have give their opinion in relation to how Clil functioned in the classrooms. This phase is actually very important, because some of the activities which the teachers found which can be very effective in the classrooms may not be so in actual teaching. So that we have to have a kind of we have to revise those aspects again, and more suitable activities can be included in the next phase. And coming to the conclusion, Clil actually is very flexible in identifying the techniques used in the classrooms, and this is only to provide a general framework in relation to how Clil can be practiced in classrooms. And a lot of contextual factors can influence the activities, and in relation to the learner factors, and even the level of the teachers can also influence the way in which Clil can be practiced. And another thing is that we can use a lot of subjects, a number of subjects in the classrooms, and even literature can be used as a subject in this method of Clil. And coming to, let me conclude, and Clil actually uses active involvement of learners, which is learner centric, which we have discussed, and it uses a lot of communicative language techniques to make learning very interactive. And the third thing related to Clil is that it integrates content and language in a very successful manner. And actually find that the national education policy of our country gives great importance to the integration of content and language, and it is found to be very relevant, and as it is a very effective way of teaching both subject and language. Thank you very much.